Did you know that inside your DNA lies an incredible story? A story about the journeys of our families from long ago. Think of it like this. Your DNA is made up of many threads, each one a part of your ancestor's story. Some parts of the story are straight and easy to follow, just like straight threads. They help us see our whole family's history. But some parts of our DNA are twisted and full of secrets, like complicated patterns of thread work. In every part of this story, whether it's simple or complicated, there's something that keeps coming back, the lasting impact of slavery. Just like I found out surprising things about my own past, which I'll tell you about later, your DNA might have some surprises too. What do you think your DNA might say about your family's history? Share your ideas in the comments below. Our DNA is like a map that shows where people in our family who lived before us came from. Imagine it as scars made of DNA, each one telling a part of our family's long history. These scars have stories about difficult times from the past. They help us remember how millions of people were treated very unfairly a long time ago. These scars have both happy and sad stories, all mixed together. But even happy stories have some unfairness in them. These scars in our DNA weave a long, complicated story of slavery that's a part of our history. Just like I found out some surprising things about my family's past, our DNA can show us stories of slavery and where they started. The strands in our DNA are like tales passed down from generation to generation. Welcome to Black History Diary, where we uncover the hidden stories of our history. Let us embark on this journey to learn, unlearn, and then relearn. In this video, I'm going to share how I discovered these hidden stories in my DNA. We'll find out how some people trace their heritage by traveling to other regions, and yet some people still cannot locate their ancestors despite modern technology and many popular dedicated services. Let's dive into these diverse experiences of people seeking the knowledge of their ancestry and explore the reasons why these experiences are different for different people. Like many people today, I took a DNA test with Ancestry.com and 23andMe to uncover some of the secrets hidden in my DNA. To my surprise, although not entirely unexpected, I found connections to Ireland, Sweden, India, and the UK in my DNA. But hold on. How did that happen? I'm pretty sure it was not on purpose. Many people wonder at these surprisingly unbelievable results. A Black individual with European heritage? How is that even possible? This has something to do with the scars of slavery preserved in our DNA. The scars that echo the harrowing tales of oppression, cruelty, and many a time, sexual abuse. This DNA is a part of the history that closely connects those who were in power and those who were mistreated. So, when I reflect on racism or unfairness, I also have to think about the part of my heritage, the ancestors responsible for these terrible actions. This affects my idea of who I truly am. Do I accept one side of myself and deny the other? Or accept all of myself? In any case, it creates a puzzle. But in my view, that's what world history is, a mystery. In fact, that's what human beings are, a paradox, a collective being of good and bad that are in constant struggle to overpower one another. Sometimes we need a little push that makes the good in us win. Now, what would be that push? It will be education, learning, and awareness. If we let the bad side win, it results in atrocities and generational trauma, exemplified in slavery, wars, and government oppression. Currently, our DNAs have revealed the less favorable aspects of humanity. A recent 2020 study analyzing the genes of over 50,000 individuals illuminated the tragic fate of millions of African slaves traded between the 16th and the 19th centuries. The data reveals a side of slavery even more gruesome than we've known. Did you know that during this period, around 2 million Africans lost their lives en route to the Americas? The horrors don't end there. This part of our history isn't just a distant past. It's a living part of us. How does learning about these truths make you feel about your own heritage? Let's find out together and understand the real impact of our shared history. Imagine being separated from your family and paraded to a new continent as a mere product, only to die afterwards because of the horrific work conditions. That's what happened to the slaves that came to the U.S. from Senegal and Gambia and other places. These slaves had high mortality rates because they worked on rice plantations, which were the most labor-intensive plantations in colonial America. What's more, while the practices of slavery among colonies and countries varied across the Americas, one phenomenon was overreaching to all the continents. It was the sex bias. The treatment of slave women left an imprint on modern genetics. Even though the majority of slaves were male, the contribution of the African female slaves in today's gene pool was significant. This skew can be connected to the rape of enslaved women by slave owners as well as other sexual exploitation. Slave women were used as a reproductive tool to create more slaves. You can catch a glimpse of this exploitation in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. In this book, Mr. Covey, a master of Frederick Douglass, buys a female slave just so she can give birth to more slaves. You may find this disturbing to see a human with body and soul being treated as mere products. But wait, the study has even more disturbing details. In Latin America, up to 17 African women contributed to the gene pool for every African male. There was a policy of branchiamento, the racial whitening in some countries, which promoted the immigration of European men to dilute African ancestry through reproduction. In the British colonized America, the promotion of contribution to the gene pool was 2 African women to 1 African man. Despite the lower proportion, the practice was still exploitative. Can you imagine a human being lowered to such a level that they are a mere tool and every aspect of them being used as a product? Do you know that even knowing your heritage is a privilege? It might sound simple in this advanced age, since a lot of services enable you to do that. In fact, it's a $3 billion industry now, but it's not that simple for many people. For a certain group of people, the family trees need to be filled in or mended. As for my ancestry, I am also part North American Indian. Imagine doing a DNA test and finding unexpected connections. What would you feel if you discovered parts of your story you never knew? This is a journey many of us are on, trying to piece together the puzzle of our past. Some people can easily trace their heritage back to a specific place and clearly identify their ancestors. This is not the case for everyone, including people with a background like mine. In the quest to discover their identity, which remains buried beneath the sediment of slave trade and migration, many Black people now travel to African countries to locate their roots. While some manage to locate them, others still remain on the lookout. But why isn't there any record of Black people's ancestry? In Africa, record keeping and accounting was conducted via oral tradition, due to which a lot of it got lost. Besides, their lineage wasn't important to those who were bringing Black people to this part of the world. So, a lot of Black Americans are looking to find the missing parts of their identity. That's another thing racism and slavery cost them. Most of us can trace the threads of our lineage back to the 1870 census. This was the first time Blacks qualified as actual people, apparently, and hence were counted as a part of the U.S. population. Beyond this period, the threads connecting them to their ancestors vanish in thin air, echoing the trauma of families split during the slave trade. For slave traders and owners, familial connections weren't important to document, so that centuries-old separation manifests itself today in the form of severed or blurred threads in our DNAs. So, yes, I can see that most of my heritage or ancestry comes from West Africa, but I have no idea about the names of the people associated with that. Now, maybe you're able to look into your ancestry and you can name all the people going back generations. This gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of homeness. But imagine not being able to identify who your great-great-grandfather, grandmother, who these people really were. More importantly, what they went through and the fact that they were considered to be no one. They weren't even considered to be people in the eyes of the oppressors. They weren't even worthy of having names. In the beginning, slaves were allotted numbers. That was their whole identity. The same practice prevails in prisons now. Do you know that the 13th Amendment does not abolish slavery entirely? It may be shocking for many that the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the stepping stone to the abolition movement, isn't abolitionist in essence. Ratified in 1865, it provides an exception to slavery. You can read it for yourself here. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Today, prisoners are still seen as slaves of the government, and the small amount they get paid for work in the prisons is not really considered a wage. Now, come to think of it, which group constitutes the largest demographic in American incarceration? It's the African Americans. And this isn't an isolated phenomenon. Rather, it is influenced by decades-old discriminatory practices. After the Civil War, the newly freed black slaves would be duly convicted of crimes and sent to the state prisons to labor without pay. It appeared to be profitable for the prisons. Until the 1930s, be they federal or state, the prisons were self-sufficient in producing the goods and foods they needed. They even produced a surplus for sale, which included industrial products. This shows that even in the post-abolition period, reliance on the slave labor didn't diminish. Maybe that's the reason for the formation of a prison system that incarcerates black people more than 5 times it does white people. That's why some people argue the legal system is strategically abused to push African Americans back into the system of repression and control. The private prisons have adopted this entrenched racism quite well. They get paid for the number of prisoners and reap the profits of slave labor. The number of younger inmates of color in private prisons is higher than their white counterparts. That's how discrimination continues within the walls of prison. The same extends to the nature of prison work too. You'd be surprised to see the blatant racism after knowing this. White inmates are favored for certain positions that are relatively convenient or skill-oriented, whereas black men are given the tasks that are hard and less skill intensive. So even in the prisons, black men have limited opportunity to learn new skills or become educated. So when I look into my DNA, I can see a story of incarceration. I can look at my ancestors and see those who didn't have names, or the names that they were given weren't names, they were numbers. Their actual names were forgotten. So to not know where you come from affects your identity. To not know who your ancestors were doesn't provide the same opportunity that others have to be able to pinpoint and identify these are my family. Because DNA has memory, some of the scars that come from the people who came from before us are still present in our DNA. The anxiety experienced by such traumatic experiences still exists in our DNA. Now, sure, we have the opportunity to change. We have the opportunity to forget and say these things don't matter today, but they do. These stories matter. These stories are in my DNA. They actually affect the complexion of those who are here today. Not only that the different complexions represent the severed familial bond, but it also deepens the divide. While the Africans and the African Americans see each other as different entities, the Black Americans with different complexions see each other differently too. Even within the Black communities, the chasm of light skin versus dark skin persists. If you're light skinned, you're called a house nigga. If you're dark skinned, you're called a field nigga. Isn't the presence of colorism within our communities ironic? A community that suffers the most at the hands of this discrimination, letting it flourish within itself. But that has historic roots also. Back in the days of slavery, slaves with the dark skins worked in the fields and were considered brutes, whereas those with light skin were close to the house and relatively more acceptable by whites. Since they were more acceptable for whites, they became more acceptable among the blacks too. And the same acceptability standards prevail today. That separation exists today. We still suffer from the experiences that our people had before us. So it may be easy to say, why are black people always complaining? Why are black people so sensitive? People say these things because it's hard to comprehend a problem if you're not the one that experienced it. But just for a second, imagine that your father denied you and said that you don't belong to him. You'd feel it. Yeah, you'd feel it. It's just too often that we don't understand what another person is going through until we are in their place. then it matters. But if we are not the ones going through it, then it doesn't matter. We would shrug off people's protest as mere complaining. We would say that they always have a problem. But if one would like to stop the complaining, then they should acknowledge it, acknowledge what has taken place. Above all, we should learn to empathize. Otherwise, the divide is only going to deepen. The conflict between whites and blacks, within blacks and whites, and people of different religions and ethnicities would only aggravate unless we do something about it together, instead of staying on opposite sides when many of us are the same blood in the first place. With awareness and empathy, it shouldn't be hard to understand the problem that comes along with being the product of rape and then discard it because you don't have the same skin tone as the rapist. Yes, it is what happened in the past. I live with the scars of slavery daily. Scars given by the descendants of those who raped my ancestors and profited from it. We need to figure out how long it would take for us to stop this hatred. I believe it's going to take more than laws in Congress to change things. Change has to happen from within the people. We shouldn't need a law that tells us how to treat one another. We shouldn't need a law that tells us what decency is. Today, if any of these crimes were committed, most likely the person would be incarcerated. It shows that we are aware enough to formulate these laws. So why do we overlook and pretend that nothing has happened and tell people who experienced this to get over it? Imagine the repercussions of the worst tragedy in human history happening to you and being told to get over it. How would you feel?